Welcome back to GuruTalk. I'm Dave Palumbo, and today I'm joined by Layne Norton, and we're going to be talking about the calorie versus macro debate that's been raging in our YouTube, world lately. Layne, it's good to have you back on the show. How's everything going over there?
Great. Thanks for having me on so we can have a nice long-form discussion. I think this will be great for people.
Yeah, people like being educated, especially since there's so many different sides of the equation, and you know that the bottom line is that usually the truth is somewhere in the middle, and I think people gravitate towards extremes because I think we're an extreme industry. I think bodybuilders are extremes, and so they're always looking for that secret or magic solution to whatever they perceive to be their problems. Now, you've been very busy lately. They've been writing books, and I see all these books online that you've been cranking out. How the heck do you have time to write all these things?
It's interesting. I actually really like writing about something when I feel like I want to learn more about it.
Yeah.
So by writing and having to go so far in depth, it just helps me learn. So I was actually funny story. One of my books I wrote, Fat Loss Forever, I wrote it in 8 weeks.
Wow.
It's almost a 400-page book.
That's sick.
But it's because I got asked to go on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I was going to debate, fat loss, calories, that sort of thing. And I wanted to make sure that I was kind of, shored up on my knowledge. So when I went in for the debate, I was good to go. And so writing the book was my way of kind of being a great refresher as well as learning more. So I have actually really enjoyed that. I really enjoy writing.
I find that too. It's funny. Sometimes you start sitting down to write something and you actually have to, you want to make sure you get your facts straight. So you Google stuff and you look stuff up and you look at some of the research out there and you start saying, you know what, I really didn't have as good a grasp as I thought I had on this subject. And now I seem to have put it together. So I think the writing of a book sometimes actually makes you learn the subject even better. I know when I teach my Guru course, it's the same thing. Every time I finish a course, I'm like, you know what? I understand the topic better now that I've explained it to everyone else.
Yeah, no, that's when they grow you up, they tell you or when you grow up, they tell you the best way to learn something is to teach somebody else. So yeah. I would agree with that.
And also, repetition is really important. Sometimes I feel like I'm redundantly saying the same thing over and over on a lot of the education stuff I put out. But the truth is that the more people hear it, the more it solidifies it, because I don't think many people absorb things the first go around. You got to actually kind of, almost digest it a little bit inside.
Yeah, or you only get bits and pieces of it, or there's what you say and then what the person interprets and what you understand, which I think is going to be a lot of our back and forth is going to be just differences in interpretation of what we see and what people have said. And a lot of times, when you're talking about what's going on, somebody says, what do you think about this person who said this? When in reality, they didn't completely say that. It was something else.
Sure.
So I think that's definitely a big part of it. And also, with repetition, your audience, especially with social media, they only see 1% of what you post. So you've actually got to be repetitious.
That's true. I forget that also. Sometimes you could think you could do, you might have said the same story. I could have told the story on 14 different podcasts and every person who watched it saw it once. They're like, no, I never heard you tell that story before. I'm like, you didn't? I guess, I assume everyone watches everything that I do. That's just my ego telling me that.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Now, the interesting thing about the subject we're going to talk about, which is calories, is that this topic has been raging probably since the calorie terminology was originally created. And I don't think anyone really has a true grasp on what goes on in the body. If we did, we would have a definitive system of how everything works. So a lot of this has to do, and let's face it, there's so much genetic variability about how people respond to different diets that there really isn't one diet that fits all. It's impossible to have that. And I've seen people who respond tremendously well to one diet I've given them, you give it to the next person, they get fat from it. So there is variability according to people because we are genetically variable.
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting point you bring up. I think that it's much less physiological variability as it is personal preference. And let me preface that by what I mean. I actually just did a podcast with Fuad Abiad and Chris Tuttle, and we kind of talked about this. So people kind of say, well, I did all these different diets and they didn't work for me. When in reality, a lot of times they just struggled to be adherent. They just struggled to be really consistent with it because it wasn't something they liked. And then they find something they like, they're really consistent with it, and they're like, oh, well, this worked so much better for me.
Sure.
When in reality, it was, I think they feel like it's a physiological thing, when in reality, it's probably a little bit of a psychological thing. And I talk about one of the things I've really spent a lot of time looking up recently has been the power of suggestion and placebo. Mm-hmm. And people get really offended when you suggest the placebo because they think that you're calling them a liar. But in reality, placebo is extremely powerful, and I'll just give one example before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of calories.
Layne, explain what the term placebo means, because some people may not know what it means.
Yeah, great question. So it's really the power of suggestion. So for example, Dave, let's say you're somebody, you're a noob in the industry, and you look up to me, you respect me, whatever, and I tell you, hey, I want you to do this program. You're going to grow a ton of muscle. It's going to be awesome. If you go into that program being very fired up and very excited about it, the likelihood that you're going to do better is high, right? Whereas if I kind of say, well, it's not magic, it may work, but it depends, then you don't have as high of opinion about it, and maybe you just don't feel as enthusiastic about it. So that's kind of another example of placebo is they gave a while back, there was a study where they told people, they gave them a sugar pill essentially.
Right, that's right.
And they said, this is going to help with your allergies. So these are people who had allergy problems.
Right.
And over 70% of people reported that their allergies improved, right? Now, what's interesting is some of the physiological markers of their allergies actually did improve.
Right.
So that's interesting. The most powerful study, I think, to point out, there was recently, you're familiar with the hormone Ghrelin. So Ghrelin is what we call the hunger hormone. It acts in opposition to leptin. Right. They took people and they stratified them based on their genetic polymorphisms of what their Ghrelin levels are. Gotcha. So essentially, you had low Ghrelin secretors, you had high Ghrelin secretors, and you would expect the people who were low Ghrelin secretors to have low hunger, and vice versa, and the high Ghrelin secretors to have high hunger, right? So they knew the genetic information of these people, and then they randomly told them one thing or the other. So you had kind of 4 quartiles of people. You had low leptin, told they were low leptin. You had low leptin, told they were high leptin. You had high leptin, told they were low leptin. And you had high leptin, told they were high leptin. They found that their genetics pretty much didn't matter at all. What matters is what they told them. And they actually saw their Ghrelin levels change based on what they told them. So if they told somebody who was low, hey, you're a high Ghrelin secretor, they actually saw their Ghrelin go up. So when I say, and it's not like you can just say to yourself, okay, secrete more Ghrelin, right? No. It doesn't work that way.
It's your belief is what you're saying. It's the belief. Right,
so the power of suggestion is so powerful, it can actually change your physiology.
Well, your thoughts create your reality. It's a trite saying, but it's really true.
There's obviously limits. You can't tell yourself, well, I believe I can fly and then jump off the Empire State Building and make it, right? But certainly they do have an influence. And so I think just setting up this entire thing, it's important to understand when people say that I against anecdote or anything like that. It's not that. I just think anecdote has limited applicability to the general population because when I say what works for one thing may not work for somebody else. That's true, but a lot of that boils down to personal preference and placebo in terms of what that's been suggested to them and that sort of thing.
Well, assuming let's put the placebo effect aside. Let's talk about physiologically, what's going on. And I know we can't remove the mind from the equation, but for argument's sake, let's remove the mind. Let's talk about a calorie. Talk about what you define a calorie as, so that since you're the PhD guy, I'm gonna let you do the definitions and from a science perspective, and then I'll just throw my 2 cents in that don't mean a lot. So go ahead.
Sure. This is a great question because a lot of people don't actually know what calories are. So calories aren't molecules that you can look at under a microscope or anything like that. Calories are just how much literal energy is in the chemical bonds of the macronutrients that we eat, right? So
as defined by what?
So if you put something in a bomb calorimeter and you burn it,
right,
these are the values that are given off. Now, actually, protein is a little bit different. Protein gives off about 5.5 calories per gram, but the nitrogen component is not metabolizable, so they subtract that out, and that gives you about 4 calories per gram, which is similar to carbohydrate, which is 4 calories per gram, and then fat is 9 calories per gram. So that is just literally referring to the energy content of those foods.
Right.
So that's
in a closed system, like it's basically an oven that they're burning the stuff up at, and they're producing whatever they put in. They got to get energy out.
Correct. So I think if we look back to your video, one of the things you brought up was, well, the human body isn't a closed system, which is true.
Right.
But the thing to remember is that is accounted for in energy expenditure. So you brought up the fact that, protein is different than carbohydrate or fat. That is true. We have something called one of the components of our total daily energy expenditure, or calories out, as we call it, right? Yeah. Calories in, calories out. Right. So one of the components of calories out is what's called the thermic effect of food.
Right.
And that is the amount of energy that you must put into the system to get the energy out. So human bodies is a poor analogy, but kind of similar to a car, right? You can't just put gas in your car and magically you get the energy out. You have to put energy in, and that's why you have a battery, right? Because you have to start that car.
Right.
So you have to put energy into the system. Now you get out more energy than you put in. Otherwise, we'd all starve to death, based on our physiology. But you do have different levels of thermic effect of food. So for example, fats are about 0 to 3%, carbs are about 5 to 10%, and protein is about 20 to 30%. What I mean by that is how much of the energy that is stored in that is required by the body to get it out.
To process the food, to use the food for what it's supposed to be used for.
Correct.
Right.
So if we look at, let's just take an example. If we have a diet where we have 200 grams of, I did some calculations. So let's say a 2,000 calorie a day diet, compare 200 grams of protein a day, 200 grams of carbs, 50 grams of fat, with a diet that does 100 grams of protein, 300 grams of carbohydrate, and 50 grams of fat, right? So if we run those calculations of, okay, how many calories from each, and then we take out the God, this is going to kill me.
Metabolizable.
The metabolizable energy. So what you yield out of all that, the amount of TEF from the lower protein diet is about 230 calories. So that's how much you burned to get out energy from that diet, 230 calories. If you look at the TEF for the higher protein diet, so the doubling of protein, it's about 320 calories. So you've got about a 90 calorie day difference there. Now, that is a difference, but it's not so massive, right? Like 90 calories a day isn't going to be the difference between somebody getting fat versus not getting fat. That being said, there's more that goes into protein in terms of lean body mass. Protein has effects on muscle protein synthesis, which is actually part of its effect on energy expenditure as well. So I guess what I would point out from kind of your talk is that even if you do, really kind of drastic differences in protein, it does change the energy output, but it's not a huge drastic change. What's probably more important actually when it comes to something like protein is that, and up to a certain point, because there is an anabolic cap, protein can help increase lean body mass and is more likely to produce an increase in lean mass versus fat mass, but even that has limits.
Well, so what you're basically saying is that there's variables. Now you're talking about the thermic effect of food. There's other variables that go into that as well that extract caloric usage, or I don't even like the term calorie, energy usage. Like you said, if you build more muscle now, that muscle requires more energy, okay? If you eat more carbs, you're going to produce more insulin. And we know that insulin has an effect also on how the body utilizes different calories, whether it stores it or doesn't. your insulin sensitivity, if you're insulin resistant or insulin sensitive. It depends on how you utilize that energy that you put into the system. I mean, a good analogy is an airplane. If you're flying an airplane that normally gets 30% efficiency out of its engine, right? If you have high winds blowing, okay, you're going to get much worse gas mileage, right? It's going to require much more energy to go into that, put into that plane to do the same flight you normally would do with less wind. I mean, so there's other variables that obviously will extract more energy out of that system, which makes it not a calorie in, calorie out thing anymore, because you don't know all the variables and how they play in and interact with these different requirements.
Well, let me address that point. So first thing, in the short term, the thermic effect of food actually does capture protein turnover. So that is one of the things it does capture. As far as the long term, if you build more lean body mass, it does require more energy, but our best estimates are it's pretty modest. But that being said, if you probably a more indirect way it requires more energy is if you have more muscle, you can use more weight, do more work. And if you look at, so somebody who, for example, let's say 90% of a 1 rep max on squat for them is 600 pounds, right? Compared to somebody who's the same 90%, but it's 300 pounds. The person doing the 600 pounds is going to burn more calories just because there is more work component to the exercise. So as far as lean mass, creating a much greater energy requirement, it's probably modest, but some of that may also come down to training. Now, as far as your second point, it's no longer a calories in, calories out thing. It's always calories in, calories out. Now, your point is that we don't know exactly what calories out is, which is true. Yeah. So that is completely correct. But if something is having an effect on either weight loss or weight gain, it's doing so through either increasing your energy intake or decreasing it, or increasing your energy output. Now, the problem is those are very, very moving numbers. And I think a lot of people have this idea of calories in, calories out, that calories in and calories out are independent variables that are static. So for example, somebody says, well, my maintenance calories or whatever I'm supposed to consume to maintain my weight is 3,000 calories a day, but I ate 2,700 and I didn't lose weight. So therefore, calories out is bullshit. Well, two things with that. The first is that calorie calculator that the person used was probably wrong. So that's wrong. The second thing is they're not independent variables. If you, and every bodybuilder has had this experience, if you start increasing your energy intake, you'll gain weight, but at a certain point you plateau and you've got to increase it. You've got to increase it more. Yep. And then you plateau again, and then you've got to increase it more. So when you put more into the system, so it is like a car engine insofar as, like, let's say if you, here's how it would be similar. If your gas tank is your body's body fat stores, if you fill up your gas tank, when you started driving, you'd get extremely terrible gas mileage. Your body would be very inefficient with energy. The car would be very inefficient rather. But as you got closer and closer to an empty tank, it would become drastically more efficient. And we've all, bodybuilders experience this too as well, many times. What you think you're going to need to consume to get stage lean versus what you actually have to consume a lot of times ends up being way lower.
And why is that?
Yeah, because so this is a great question and brings me to my point that these are dependent variables, that they're always intertwined. As you diet, as you lose fat mass, your body will actually kind of protect yourself against starvation by decreasing your energy requirements, by decreasing your energy expenditure. So when we hear energy expenditure, I think a lot of people mistakenly think we just mean exercise, and that's not true. So the bulk of your energy expenditure for most people is just your basal metabolic rate, which is what it takes to just keep you alive, essentially, run your organs, that sort of thing. And that's about, for most people, 50 to 60% of their total daily calories they burn. Then TEF, your thermic effective foods, around 10 to 15%. And actually what's a decent amount of bulk of it is what's called NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And those are kind of small, unintentional movements you do throughout the day. So Dave, you've probably known people who were very fidgety, who tended to probably be pretty lean naturally. Yeah. So that fidgeting that like little movement, those are actually a big portion of our calorie burn per day.
The kid who used to work for me we used to tap his foot all day long, but he was fat though, so I don't know. It didn't work for him, but
well, there's always exceptions to the rules for sure.
Now, but what if let's but also you got to take into account also what about hormones? I mean, you crank testosterone into the equation, and all of a sudden, you're using calories more efficiently. You're building muscle. That's affecting calories as well. I mean, as well as if you put the opposite catabolic hormones in like prednisone, you get fat. I mean, from them changing no energy input into the system, right?
Yeah. So great points, because people. So when I talk about calories in, calories out, people think that I'm completely neglecting hormones, and I'm not. So hormones can affect calories out, and they can affect calories in as well. So testosterone, for example, is, I would say, a true nutrient partitioning agent in that it is going to, so kind of whether or not you're in a calorie deficit or surplus is going to drive weight loss or weight gain. The composition of that weight loss and weight gain can be influenced by your protein intake, your training, and of course, performance enhancing drugs. So something like testosterone, you change nothing, all of a sudden you are building more lean body mass. Right. Well, that lean body mass, the construction of that tissue is energy requiring. So you are going to rob some of that energy from fat, like assuming you're not overfeeding. Let's assuming you're just at maintenance calories where you're not gaining or losing weight. Right. If you don't have extra calories, now the muscle has to get that energy from somewhere to build that tissue, and fat is going to liberate some of its fat stores to do that. So now that still functions in an energy balance, but it just changes kind of the nutrient partitioning. As far as cortisol goes, cortisol actually, the one caveat to that is prednisone, which is kind of, the exogenous cortisol you would take if you had, some condition that requires it. Yeah. So there's a few things with that. One, it causes quite a bit of water retention. So you see an artificial shift in your weight, but not due to fat. But also it tends to increase calorie intake. And the other thing is it lowers energy expenditure. So it does lower energy expenditure. So that's still happening in the case of energy balance. The other interesting thing it does is, so my mother actually had to be on prednisone for a certain condition she had, and she did not sleep well at all. And so sleep is actually a nutrient partitioning agent as well. So if you look at people, there was actually a recent study, people who got over 8 hours of sleep per day versus people who got 5.5 hours of sleep, who were used to 8 hours of sleep, so that's an important caveat. They found that the group that was sleep deprived, the less than 5.5 hours of sleep per night, lost basically 50% lean body mass, 50% fat mass, wow. Whereas the group that got plenty of sleep almost lost exclusively body fat. Wow. So now that's a short-term study. It was only, I think, 2 weeks. So, how much can we take from that? But point being is it's still functioning in energy balance. These hormones, if they're affecting fat loss or fat gain, but they're still doing it through that same mechanism. The difficulty is in capturing how much that actually is.
Well, prednisone raises blood sugar though too. It increases the gluconeogenesis and raises blood sugar, which increases insulin output, which increases fat storage. So it does the opposite of anabolic steroids. Let's face it. It suppresses immune system. It increases blood sugar. It causes fat gain and muscle loss. So.
Yeah, it is a catabolic hormone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nasty hormone. It's not the kind of drug you want to take long term, that's for sure.
No, it's funny when people say steroids, I'm on a steroid, and people think.
I just saw an article about steroids help, COVID or something like that. They're giving steroids for COVID, and it's obviously prednisone. They're not giving Decadurabolin, for COVID, but that was the article, steroids. And every bodybuilder sees that, they immediately, assume that they're giving them Trenbolone, right? These patients, and so they go read the article, they send it to me, they don't even read it. They're like, Dave, look at this is great news. Yeah. And I'm like, did you read the article?
Well, that's called confirmation bias. You see what you want to see, and then you act on it. That's interesting though, because I think prednisone is actually an immunosuppressant. Which is
I don't know why they're giving it. I guess maybe for the lung health. I guess maybe. I don't know.
Maybe not to go too much on a tangent. I have a friend who's a doctor. He's actually seen some young people who have had pretty drastic reactions to COVID, not because their immune system was bad, but because it was so good
right.
that they kind of have you have like too much inflammation, too much of
an
inflammatory
the cytokine
response.
storm, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so as far as insulin goes, insulin is an interesting one because insulin is a positive regulator of muscle protein metabolism in terms of inhibiting muscle protein degradation and increasing muscle protein synthesis, although it's debatable whether or not it does that in terms of a physiological range. But I would say that insulin it increases fat storage on a short-term basis. But on the long term, it's still an energy balance. So there's been 30 studies to date where they equate protein and calories, and the reason these particular studies were chosen for this analysis was either they were done in a metabolic ward where they're actually measuring every single thing they're giving the people, or the food was provided for the people in the study. So we're talking about really highly controlled studies because free living studies have applicability, but not so much when we're trying to determine mechanisms, right? Because if it's free living, they can kind of be doing whatever, and dietary adherence
is notoriously poor. They may not be following it,
Yeah. So, I remember I found a free living study where they said they gave them 1,500 calories and one group didn't lose weight. And I was kind of like, okay, sure. So they found, they had, in these 30 studies, the requirement was that protein between the diets had to be equated and calories had to be equated. And as you discussed, and as we discussed, that's important because protein has effects on energy expenditure and lean body mass.
Right.
So they varied the carbohydrate and fat contents of these diets. And what they found was that fat loss was virtually identical between the two of them, even with differences in insulin levels. So I think on a short term, on a biochemical level, yes, if you raise blood sugar, you store more body fat. But one important thing to keep in mind is that fat loss is the balance it's fat balance actually. So if you want to lose fat, you have to be in a negative fat balance, which is the amount of fat you store versus the amount of fat you burn, right?
Right. So
you've got to burn more than you store. So if you're on a high carb, low fat diet, you're actually not going to store much fat because the body doesn't really use de novo lipogenesis to store carbohydrate as fat. The fat we store in adipose is only about 1 to 2% from actual carbohydrate carbon skeleton. Now that can be, I don't want people to hear that and say, well, I'll just eat a diet of all protein and carbs. If you jack carbs up enough, high enough, it can take over and act that way. So high carb, low fat diet, you have high insulin, you don't burn very much fat, but you don't store very much fat. If you have low carb, high fat, you burn a lot of fat, but you also store a lot of fat because you're eating a lot of fat. The balance between the two of them actually ends up coming back down basically to energy balance. There was, in the study, they did find a slight, when they did what's called a meta-regression, where they combine all the studies together, they did find a very slight fat loss favoritism actually towards a low-fat diet, but it was like 16 grams of fat loss it was negligible. So I think what that says is that I think insulin's got a little bit of an undeserved bad rap in terms of a kind of a long-term promoter of fat gain, when in reality it's more about, how much protein you're getting, because that's a very powerful nutrient partitioning agent, and then the overall amount of energy you're getting in.
What about if have they done a study where they did high protein, moderate fat, low carb?
So they've done.
They always do the extremes to try to prove one thing or another, but they don't look at the middle ground, which is what I recommend, because I think that everything is nutrient partitioning in a sense. I mean, protein we know is a powerful positive partitioning agent. We know that sugar is obviously a negative partitioning agent by and far, especially if you're taking excessive amounts in. Usually fats, can be neutral, or depending on what kind of how they're received in the body. But by and far, protein is your lean source of protein are your strong partitioning positive agents. Sugars are your negative agents, and so they always test the extremes. They never go in the middle and say, all right, well, let's use some positive ones and go in the middle, but let's see what happens if we go to the extreme. So what I mean, I mean, it's logical that they should do that, but they don't do that. They do a control, but they don't do like a middle ground study,
So actually amongst these 30 diets, they had all different ranges of fat and carbohydrates. Yeah. So there were some that were more moderate. And they kind of found that, basically throughout, if you got enough protein and you equated calories, the results were very similar. Now, that being said, I don't want to poo-poo people's experience because some people just enjoy eating a low carbohydrate diet. Right. So I am not saying it's not a viable way to eat. And some people enjoy a lower fat, higher carbohydrate diet. What that data says to me is that what's probably most important is making sure that you're eating a calorie level that is conducive to your goals, which is, whether you're trying to gain muscle, lose fat, and then also eating enough protein. And then amongst the rest of it, you can kind of, pick what your own preference is in terms of carbohydrate and fat breakdown. As far as nutrient partitioning goes, I think we need to kind of define that a little bit, because if we talk about nutrient partitioning, it's a great phrase, but what it basically means is that, like, let's take resistance training. Resistance training is one of the strongest nutrient partitioning agents we have, right? Sure. So if you don't change your diet at all and you eat at energy balance where you're not gaining or losing weight, you will lose fat and gain muscle.
Absolutely.
So we know this to be true. So if we talk about a partitioning agent, yes, I would argue that protein is a nutrient partitioning agent, positive. I think sugar is contextual. And what I mean by that is we do have some studies now where people eat. So there was one study in particular that was very tightly controlled, and they fed either over 100 grams of sugar a day versus about 10 grams of sugar a day, and looked at, all right, they had them both on, I think it was 1,800 calories, same protein too. And they found that both groups almost lost the exact same amount of fat. Now, what I will say is that not nutrient partitioning, I don't recommend that.
Right.
But here's why. Because if you're eating a lot of sugar, most foods that are high in sugar are not very satiating. It's going to be very difficult to eat a high sugar diet and feel satisfied, especially when you're eating something like 1,800 calories a day. So there was a guy, I'm sure you heard of Dr. Mark Haub. He was the Twinkie diet professor. Did you ever hear about that? Okay, so this guy basically ate 1,800 calories a day, almost exclusively from junk food. But he did have protein shakes to get enough protein, and I think his protein intake was around 120 grams a day, I want to say.
Yeah.
And then he took a multivitamin, right? So just making sure that his nutritional his requirements were assured, because that's impossible to do eating junk food. He lost like 27 pounds, and all of his blood markers improved. Now, what he did say was he actually didn't enjoy eating that way because he felt very unsatisfied. He said, by the end, I would have really just preferred to have a salad or something like that because it would have been much more filling. So the reason, now people will hear what I say and they'll say, well, why are you advocating for sugar consumption? I'm not. I just don't want it to be unfairly demonized, because I've had a lot of even bodybuilders who have this kind of like good, bad mentality. And what ends up happening is they're great with their nutrition until they have a little bit of that forbidden food, and then they absolutely go berserk and can't control themselves because they think they've already blown it.
Right, but if you eat sugar every day, it's certainly not going to help your fitness goals. And let's face it, we're taught, your studies are with pretty much, I wouldn't say they're sick people, but they're average people. We're talking about, in bodybuilding, you and I are talking about elite level athletes that are trying to maximize muscle gains, maximize fat loss, to get body fat into single digits, to keep their muscle at the utmost level while they're dieting so they don't lose anything. So they're going to see a much greater effect, I believe, from changing these little nuances than the general population that, all right, well, maybe 100 grams of this or that is not going to make a big difference to the average person. But for performance purposes and in terms of performing in the gym and for actually making muscle gains and burning fat, I think those nuances are absolutely imperative.
So I would actually go a little bit more the opposite direction on that, which might be a little bit counterintuitive, but I would say that when you train hard and you're consistent with your nutrition, a lot of the other stuff gets washed out. Now, again, I'm not advocating for sugar consumption. I myself eat a high fiber diet.
Yeah.
I eat a pretty moderate diet. I don't eat much purposeful sugar. So what I would actually say is that people who resistance train are more insulin sensitive. They actually handle that stuff better. And they actually, I mean, especially if you're talking about like, athletes who are doing like hours of training per day, sometimes it's actually advisable for them to consume sugar because
right, but bodybuilders are not in that category. We're not training 6 hours a day.
Right, sure. So I would say I don't have a problem with somebody who, it all depends. It's all contextually dependent. My big gripe, especially with kind of the bodybuilding community, is, and I remember I was going to do a debate with a guy who ended up backing out of it. We were going to debate, clean eating versus kind of flexible dieting. And my opening statement was going to be, I actually went through and I watched, this guy posted his cheat meals every week, right? So he was completely against macros.
Yeah.
I added up the calories from junk food that he was eating on his cheat days. It was like double the calories I was eating from junk food, but just me including it every day in moderation, right? So I think that if you're a bodybuilder and your approach is I'm going to eat a nutrient-dense diet, I would still argue that you can do that and track your macros, and that would actually help you even more. But I'm going to eat a nutrient-dense diet. But I understand that these foods, that having a little bit of them is not going to kill me.
Right.
I think that's important.
Right, but your basic diet premise is that you're still structuring your diet around a high protein intake. Okay.
Of course.
You might have a little flexibility, but you're not just saying, hey, go eat whatever the hell you want. Just keep your calories under, 2,000 or whatever that you find to be your base level. You're certainly setting up your macros to meet your requirements from a protein standpoint, which is absolutely imperative. And I don't think that you would ever debate that, right?
No, I'll tell you exactly how I set stuff up when I talk about somebody's goals. So the first thing I'm going to do when I get somebody, if whatever their goal is, fat loss, muscle gain, whatever, I'm trying to determine, okay, about how much do I think they expend per day? And if they're, and I might be a little bit off, and that's fine because as a coach, you adjust it anyway.
Right, and a lot of it's intuitive as a coach. Some people don't even need to figure it out because they're so, like a Chris Aceto, he doesn't know how much, he's just so intuitive. He's like an Italian chef that just throws stuff into the pot,
So I'll figure out, okay, I think they probably this many calories, and then once I set calories, I set protein.
Yeah.
That is the next thing that goes in.
Now, why do you do that?
Well, again, protein is the most important macronutrient for lean body mass.
In saying that, though, Layne, you're completely discounted your calorie, debate. That saying that calories in are equal calories out because you're qualifying what calories you need to consume.
No, but that's a false dichotomy. So I've never claimed that it didn't matter what your macros were. I just say that calories do matter.
Well, so but calories only matter after your macros are figured out. So I mean that's you can't have both ways. You have to go one way or the other.
Well, I think you can't. So I want to know what your position is. So you're saying that if protein matters, that means calories can't matter.
No, I say that macros matter more than calories do because if you're going to set protein first, okay, then the calorie number is not the most important thing. The macros is the most important thing, and then you just figure based on after you're all right, I need this much protein, how much more energy does the person need to subsist for the rest of the day, and I'll give them a little less so that they lose weight. I mean, that's your premise, right?
So no, I set calories first, and then I distribute to protein first from those calories. But
you don't set protein according to the person's body weight and what you think that they require lean body mass wise to recover from the workout?
So I set based on lean body mass.
Right.
Yes. Because protein is based off of that. And then
But calories are not. Protein is based off that.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Well, calories are very highly related to lean body mass as well, but it also depends on some other factors as well. So what I would say is that I think we're probably closer than you think we are.
No, I think we're exactly there. I just think that you're portraying one thing, but you're actually not really. But that's not really what you believe. You believe that I know that you believe that macros are important because you can't achieve your physique goals without them. So calories is really not what you're proposing. You're proposing energy, a certain set energy requirement, given the fact that you've met your macros, because macros are the most important driving force towards positive, nutrient partitioning and achieving muscle gains and fat loss.
Well, so the what I would say is that macros and energy are intrinsically tied, since macros are the energy containing components.
But Layne, they're not, because you know why? Because people, when they sit down to figure their diet, when they hear the word, all I have to worry about is my calories, they've dismissed the fact that they need to worry about macros. So it's for most people, I'm not saying you, most people, it's one or the other. It's macros or calories. They think, by the stuff that you've been saying in your videos, that calories are more important. And I know that's not what you believe. That's why I got you on here today, because I want to clarify this point.
Well, I think that, it's contextually dependent. If I say to somebody, calories aren't important, here's, eat this much protein and then do whatever else. If they're eating 5,000 calories a day and putting on loads of fat, that's not good.
Right.
I think that by the same token, if I told somebody, hey, 2,000 calories a day and you'll lose fat, but they're eating a very low protein diet and they're having a lot of weight loss from lean body mass as well, that's also not good. So I think the two, I haven't seen many people in the flexible dieting community argue that protein doesn't matter. I'm not sure if those people are out there.
But flexible dieting is not about calories. They're still about macros. They just say, we don't care where you get the macros from. The bomb calorimeter doesn't give the true equation. That's why the term, I don't use calorie, I use energy, because bomb calorimeter says that protein and carbs are essentially the same, because they produce the same energy in that closed system, and we're just not a closed system. And that's why protein is more important inside the human organism, because it has a different effect on the body than does carbohydrates, even though in the bomb calorimeter they're energetically equivalent.
Let me put it to you this way. So let's look at calories or energy as a budget. Okay, so somebody who has a very high energy expenditure is going to have a very high budget, and we've known people like this in bodybuilding who need 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 calories a day just to be able to add some mass, right? We've known people like that. We've also known people who have got to get really, really low on their calories in order to get down to a certain body weight, or body fat rather. Now, if you're a company and you have a budget, you have part of that is allotted for paying your employees, part of that is allotted for marketing, part of that's allotted for whatever else. So let's just say, for example, in your particular company, the most important part of that budget is for marketing. Right? Let's just say that's where you get the best return on your investment, and that you feel is the best. So you have a certain level of budget, let's say $100,000 a month, and the first thing you do, the first thing that you're putting that money towards, you say, okay, well, I need this much for marketing because I know that's the most important thing, right?
Well, yeah, but the argument you're giving, that means that all money is not equal. It's how you appropriate the money is more important. That's a macronutrient debate.
Hang on, let me finish.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that all money does not have the same effect on your business, right? But all money is equal. A dollar is still a dollar, right? Like your $2 are the same. But if you put those dollars in different buckets, you might have better outcomes. Like, for example, if your normal marketing budget's $30,000 and all of a sudden you say, we're going to do 5 this month, and we're going to put that $25,000 towards, I don't know, remodeling the office or something like that, right? You're not going to see the same, you may not see the same benefit on your bottom line, right? So that's the same thing with energy. I'm setting my budget to protein first because I know that's going to have the biggest return on investment for me.
It's not a good analogy. It's not an appropriate analogy. It sounds good. It's a good logical argument, but it's not an equivalent analogy, because protein and carbs and fat are not equivalent macronutrients just like money, like a dollar is to a dollar is to a dollar is. So,
Well, keep in mind that calorie is just a unit.
It would be like equating like jet fuel to like, kerosene to like, turpentine. I mean, that might be a better analogy,
Well, let me just leave this one. So people will say things like all calories are not created equal. That's not true. Calories are simply a unit of energy or a unit of energy.
It's fake. It's a fake, but it's a fake unit of energy because it's determined in a closed system. You can't really calculate how much energy is in protein because protein packs a much stronger wallop in the body, in the physiological body, than does carbohydrates or fat. We know what it does. It actually has and I say it, I know you foo-foo this, but it does have a drug-like effect on the body because it drives protein synthesis at the expense of stored body fat. We know that.
Well, let me finish what I was going to say.
Go ahead. I'm sorry for interrupting
you. You may agree with the statement that comes after what I was first going to say. Okay. So I was going to say all calories are the same. All sources of calories do not have the same effect on energy expenditure. So, for example, if you eat a chicken breast, you're probably going to have a greater effect on your TEF, on your energy expenditure, than if you ate, a stick of butter, right? Of the same calories. It'd be a small stick of butter. But so your sources, they contain the same energy, but that energy has differential effects on your energy expenditure, which is 100% correct. So again, that's what makes it a reasonable analogy with dollars, because the dollars are still the same, but where you put those dollars could have a differential output on your business, on what your revenue stream is.
It's not an appropriate analogy, and it's deceptive. It's deceptive. The term calorie is deceptive because it implies that they're all equal, but they're really not all equal, because if you tell people calories in equals calories out, that it's all about calories, then they're going to say, well, I'm going to go to Weight Watchers and I'm going to have the little brownie treat because as long as I'm under my 1,000 calories for the day, I'm going to lose weight and I'm going to look good. And we know that's not the case. So it is deceptive. We're on the same page. We're arguing semantics at this point. The bottom line is that we know that protein is a very important driving force. And we know that carbohydrates has a great degree of variability because everyone handles carbs differently, because some people intrinsically are insulin resistant, some people intrinsically are insulin sensitive, most people are somewhere in the middle range, and we know that exercise can influence that a lot, and the diet you eat can influence that. Do you think that eating less sugar will make you more insulin sensitive?
So there was actually a study done a while back, and I forget the author name. I can provide it if you like. But they looked at calorie equated low glycemic versus high glycemic, and they found that initially in the first couple of weeks there was a little bit better response of insulin sensitivity with the low glycemic group, but over time the biggest driving factor was the weight loss, the fat loss, which was equivalent between groups. So it does appear so I don't want to completely, just strawman things. If you are really concerned about improving your blood markers very quickly, consuming a low glycemic diet will rectify that, or You'll get a little bit of a boost a little bit sooner. But in the long run, it's mostly about getting to a healthy body fat level.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Absolutely.
What's that?
I agree that losing body fat is the most important driving factor.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't realize, same thing with inflammation. People get the cart before the horse. People think that, I hear people say, well, I have inflammation and that's why I can't lose fat. No, body fat is pro-inflammatory because body fat or adipose secretes adipokines, which are cytokines, which are inflammatory. And if you, regardless of diet, you see these markers resolve if you lose enough weight. In fact, there was a meta-analysis, and let me explain what that means because a lot of our audience might not know. So in a meta-analysis, what they do is they try to find studies that are similar in design and that ask similar questions, and then they see, okay, can we combine those studies to come up with kind of a consensus? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
and it's actually a very rigid statistical analysis. So it's not them kind of like looking at it and eyeballing the data. It's actually a really rigid statistical analysis. And there was one done back in 2014 by Naud, and they looked at, okay, if we have isoenergetic, same energy between diets, and same protein, if we vary the carbohydrate and fat intakes, do we see differences not just in weight loss, but also in blood markers? So do their blood markers improve? Is one diet superior to another?
Right.
And basically what they found was that 95 to 99% of the health benefits from those diets could just be completely explained by the fat loss. Now, I will say that if you look at a low-carb diet, it's probably not the best. So low-carb, high-fat is probably not the best for total and LDL cholesterol, but does tend to improve HDL and triglycerides a little bit better than like a low-fat, high-carb diet. On the flip side, low-fat tends to improve cholesterol better, LDL better, and then as far as blood sugar and blood insulin goes, in the short term, low-carb might be a little bit better. In the long term, they're pretty equivalent just based on if you lose the same amount of fat.
Let me ask you a question. Anti-inflammatory diets. I eat a very anti-inflammatory diet, not exclusively, meaning that I don't eat foods that have a lot of arachidonic acid that incite a lot of inflammation. I just think it's healthier for longevity purposes. Probably not great for building huge amounts of muscle because it seems like the inflammatory response is responsible, obviously, for some initiating muscle growth. But what do you think about anti-inflammatory diets? What's the research say on that in terms of is it better at losing weight or does it not matter?
So it's hard to kind of directly answer your question because we don't really have a best practice what constitutes an anti-inflammatory diet.
What about just if someone's C-reactive protein levels are really low, do they have an easier or harder time, or does it not make a difference on weight loss? I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah. So this is it doesn't seem to matter in terms of weight loss.
Okay.
It seems to go the other way, that weight loss influences inflammation a lot more than inflammation influences weight loss.
Gotcha.
But you keep in mind, inflammation roughly can be categorized into kind of two different categories. And that's one, you have your systemic inflammation, which is kind of your levels of CRP,
right.
Which is a biomarker for that. And that seems to have some prediction rates in terms of heart disease, cancer, possibly, those sorts of
Arthritis,
things.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, before we go too crazy on that, people have a hard time. It's hard to tease out those variables because people who are high inflammation also tend to be obese. They higher likelihood of smoking. They eat more processed foods. They eat more calories. So I tell people a lot of these like negative health behaviors all are kind of wrapped up together. So like people ask me like, are you worried about this thing? And I'm like, well, you're exercising, you're eating well, you're being consistent. Am I worried that you had this one food that we think might be a little bit, inflammatory? No, probably not. So there's that systemic inflammation, and then there's local inflammation. So what happens when you resistance train, for example, let's say you train legs, and everybody's had the experience of an inflammatory response in their legs post-training. Those two things happen pretty much independently. So if you train really, really hard,
right.
That inflammation, it's not like that inflammation that's in your legs. I mean, your elbow doesn't then start getting sore, right? You don't start getting a headache, and we don't have, your arteries don't clog up and fill up with cholesterol, right?
Right.
In fact,
it's not chronic inflammation. It's acute.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in fact, what's interesting is that inflammation seems to operate in kind of an optimal zone. And what I mean by that is, too low inflammation is probably bad, and too high inflammation is definitely bad. So and for example, all we need to do is look at the research on ibuprofen and muscle growth to look at that.
Right.
So when they gave ibuprofen to young, I think it was female college soccer players, and had them resistance train, they found that the group that was getting ibuprofen grew less muscle than the group that wasn't.
Which makes sense, yeah.
But when they gave it to elderly people, and I think it was above age 65.
Yeah, I saw that study, yeah. Interesting.
The ibuprofen group actually grew more muscle.
Yeah, because they have excessive inflammation in their body, right?
Right. So exactly. So people who are elderly, they have higher levels of inflammation. So by bringing them back down into more of a normal range, now they were in that sweet spot.
Yeah.
The young people who don't have high levels of inflammation, who are otherwise healthy, taking it actually pushed them out of the low range of what's optimal. So, and I realize this is kind of a long, convoluted answer to your question, but as far as eating an anti-inflammatory diet, I think it's probably not the it's probably not the anti-inflammatory effects so much, because we find that tends to be just a kind of a lifestyle sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's the fact that foods that are typically thought of as anti-inflammatory are just nutrient dense and low in calories,
Gotcha.
right? So, if you're eating a lot of vegetables,
right.
You're eating high protein, you're just not going to be over consuming a ton of calories. And so it's hard. That's why we say it's hard to disconnect these two. A lot of people want to try and pick out like one nutrient or one thing. And what we find over time is when you extract single nutrients out of diets, even things that are supposed to be like really good for you, and you put them in high doses, we just don't see the same benefits as kind of like just having an overall healthy diet.
The reason I say that, Layne, is because, like everyone's into grass-fed beef now and free-range this. And so the grass-fed beef obviously has way more omega-3s, a lot less arachidonic acid, because they're not feeding the cows corn, they're feeding them grass, they're eating a natural diet, they're producing more omega-3 fats in their body. And so when you eat those meats, obviously you're not getting all that arachidonic acid, which is pro-inflammatory. So I just wondered if eating a diet like that is better for fat loss or not. I sometimes think for muscle building, for bodybuilding, you're better off eating this stuff, the grain-fed, stuff. Because I was, I'm always at the McDonald's. When I ate McDonald's every day, I feel like I grew muscle better. I don't know if it was from all the inflammatory, arachidonic acid in there, or if it was from the hormones they put in there. I don't know, but I don't know if there's any studies to even track any of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies. If I had to guess something, I would guess that the grass-fed animals probably don't have as much marbling in that meat, probably don't have as much body fat. So you're getting more omega-3s, but you're also getting less total fat as well. Maybe. Which is probably kind of a confounding issue that we have, trouble kind of differentiating these studies, because, okay, was it the extra omega-3s or was it the fact that they just had less overall fat? Right. And a greater proportion of it was omega-3s. Right. And it could be a combination of both, right? So I don't want to make it seem like there's nothing that you can do that's anti-inflammatory, because there is. In fact, one of the best things you can do that's anti-inflammatory is resistance training. That's absolutely one of the best things you can do. In fact, I kind of use this to break down kind of the acute versus chronic argument. I don't know if you watched the debate between James Wilkes and Chris Kresser on Joe Rogan's podcast about the Game Changers film. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't watch the whole thing, because I wish I had 3 hours to spend watching that stuff. But yeah, I did. Yeah,
I broke down the whole thing on my website.
You did?
Which probably took about 30 hours. It was awful. So there's one part where James says, well, if you've just trained and you're inflamed, you don't want to eat animal meat and then have to deal with that inflammation on top of it. And I think this represents a really fundamental misunderstanding of how inflammation works. So if we were worried about inflammation from training, like let's take training just in general. Like if you took somebody who didn't know any science about resistance training, and you just said, I'm going to make you do something that's going to increase your heart rate, increase your free radical production, increase your inflammation, and increase your blood pressure, what do you think? People will be like, oh, that sounds terrible.
Right. That's exercise, yeah.
Right. But and exercise does all that. Yeah. It increases your inflammation, all this kind of stuff. It increases your blood sugar in some cases, right? But what happens over time? It lowers all of those things, because it's almost like I don't want to be triggering for some people out there, but it's almost like a vaccine, right? So it gives you a controlled dose of a stressor, and your body becomes better off at handling.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it also represents James's misunderstanding, and again, a lot of people have this misunderstanding of inflammation at a systemic level versus
a local level. Right.
And those are two different things. And I even had somebody say one time, the reason I injured my lower back was because I was inflamed because I was eating sugar in my diet.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous.
And I'm like, you don't understand how that shit works. Like my lower back got inflamed because I injured it.
Yeah, exactly. It
was not the cart before the horse.
I tell people localized inflammation from like training is like it's like someone yelling, "Help! Help! Come on, send help! Come on, fix this muscle that we just damaged." And that's what it is. It's not doing it all over the body. It's just locally happening,
Right. So. Exactly. Which is why when you squat, your arms aren't sore the next day. Right?
Exactly.
So.
Now, Layne, you got a new book that just came out. It's called The Complete Guide to Reverse Dieting. First of all, what is it about? Just give us a brief synopsis, and how can people get that thing?
Yeah, so reverse dieting, for those that aren't familiar, is kind of I don't want to say I coined the term, but I would say I popularized it.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a methodology of adding calories in a controlled manner in order to increase your energy expenditure, increase your calorie intake while limiting fat gain. So I've noticed a lot of people when they finish diets and they don't have an exit strategy, they just pile the weight right back on. And that goes for bodybuilders and for average folk as well. So this book kind of gives you a blueprint of how to approach not only the diet after the diet, but if you're just somebody who has a lot of trouble losing weight, like you're somebody who has been a chronic yo-yo dieter,
right.
Your energy expenditure has become low over time because if you yo-yo diet, that's what happens. This book will help you kind of improve that by improving your energy expenditure by feeding you more, but in a controlled fashion. Dave, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but if you I saw this when I was growing up and I didn't really understand it until I learned the science later, but there'd be a lot of guys who would want to do like really lean bulks, right?
Yeah.
And they said, well, I'm just going to add 100 calories, right? Above my maintenance.
Yeah.
And what would happen is they'd add 100 calories and nothing would happen.
No.
Right?
No.
They'd just keep waiting for their weight to go up and nothing would happen. And that's because you have this kind of buffering zone where if you add small enough amounts of calories slowly enough, your body, I don't want to say it's kind of a bro sciencey term, but your body can kind of just buffer it out through increasing energy expenditure.
Well, I think it all goes back to the set point, Layne. Your body doesn't want to be heavier, it doesn't want to be lighter, so small changes, your body will just kind of burn off or slow down to prevent a change in weight. Yeah.
So the reverse dieting guy is basically like, what is it, who is it for, and how to set that sort of thing up.
Gotcha.
That's kind of our most niche book. And then obviously we have the Complete Contest Prep Guide, which is that's more of a step-by-step, get you ready for stage. Here's what you need to know. Here's what to do, and here's how to do it. Kind of a step-by-step guide.
And that's obviously very. A lot of people ask me about that. Where can they read stuff about doing that? And you don't have to. The fact that you set it up in a very methodical way, I think, is what people are going to really benefit from in that format, because they don't know how to structure all that stuff. And so I think that's probably a very useful book.
Yeah, when I set out to write, I kind of set out, okay, if I was coaching somebody, what would I want them to know going into it?
Yeah.
How would I set things up? And then how would I coach them along the way?
Gotcha.
Right? And then my other book, which is kind of more for gen population, but I actually think a lot of coaches could benefit from, is called Fat Loss Forever, which is kind of my fat loss manifesto, which is going over kind of not just what matters for fat loss, but what is ordering it in the priority of what matters, right? So what are the most important things? What are the least important things? And not just that, but also what are the behaviors that is important? Because it's kind of like, I like to use money examples because I think that's a little bit more intuitive for people. We know if you want to become wealthy, you have to save more than you spend. And that's true whether you make $50,000 a year or $50 million a year.
Sure.
So, but telling somebody if they're not accruing money, it's just saying, well, just save more. That's usually not, because it's not a knowledge problem, it's a behavior problem.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And food is very much the same way. We just had this debate about calories in, calories out, and I'm saying, yes, physiologically it comes down to that, but telling an obese person, hey, just eat less and burn more calories is a very unhelpful way of approaching it. It's not a math problem. If we were doing math, we wouldn't be in this problem in the first place. It's a behavior problem.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's kind of addressing all that.
Cool.
And then, our app, which just launched, which if you don't feel like reading and you don't feel like having to do math yourself, the app does it all for you.
There you go. Now, what's the app called?
Yeah, so that's called Carbon Diet Coach, which was it's available on iOS and Android.
Okay.
And we already have, after a month, about 10,000 members on there who are really happy.
Crazy.
It basically we built it to be an automated coach. So when we set up to build it, it was myself, my wife Holly, and our friend who's a registered dietitian, Keith Crocker.
Cool.
We're all physique competitors. We're all athletes. But we set it up and we said, okay, if we were coaching a person, how would we coach this person? And we had hundreds, if not thousands, of case studies that we ran through it to build the logic behind it. And we've spent a ton of money and a ton of time creating it, and it's going very well. And like, for example, I mean, you know how brutal people can be in the App Store.
Yeah.
We have a rating of 4.8 stars in the App Store right now.
Excellent. Great.
So people are loving it. So it's basically you're going to enter in your information just like you would a coach. You tell them some information. It's going to tell you, okay, here's what we recommend. And then you're going to check in every week, and it's going to adjust that to optimize it based on how you respond. Yeah, really cool.
Very good.
Just like a coach would. And, of course, it includes a built-in food tracker with barcode scanner, all that kind of stuff. So you don't have to worry about it. It's super easy to use. And, we're really proud of it.
Cool. Very cool. You're doing some great stuff. You keep them busy, and that's great, and educating people, and that's what I'm all about as well. And I appreciate you taking a nice chunk of your time and coming on the show, Layne. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Like I always tell people, you and I could have friendly debate, but I think you're one of the good guys in the business, and you're doing some great stuff. And I always believe that the educators out there who have a knowledge base and are really basing their decisions on what they're telling people out there on science are doing our community a very good service, because there's a lot of, we know the bro science, and we don't have to go into it now, but there's a lot of misinformation out there. So keep doing what you're doing, and I greatly appreciate that. I know the community does as well.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate you having me on and really willing to have the discussion. Even though we don't agree on everything, I believe that you are trying to serve the community and put out good content, and I respect that.
All I can do is try, Layne. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up another edition of GuruTalk. I'm Dave Palumbo with Layne Norton. We'll see you next time.